Surprisingly, one of the biggest reasons advisors lose assets isn't due to performance. They lose them because the relationship never transferred after the death of a client. And if for you, the first meaningful interactions you're having with your ideal client's children happen after a death, you're already behind. Today, we're going to talk about how elite advisors are using simple but intentional tools like the family phone call and the legacy package to connect with the next generation, to deepen loyalty with their best clients, to create meaningful value-added services, but ultimately to protect against the most predictable form of attrition in our industry: time. So let's get started.
This is The Rare Advisor, a show for financial advisors who want to build and grow their practice through the use of a business model supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. The Rare Advisor is brought to you by the Advisor Protocol Consulting Team at USA Financial.
Welcome back to another edition of the Rare Advisor podcast, where we help financial professionals create recurring and repeatable events that deepen relationships, elevate the client experience, and build referable practices. I'm your host, Aaron Grady, and with me again is my semi-regular co-host and practice management consultant at USA Financial, Allan Oehrlein. Thanks for joining me again today, Allan.
Absolutely, Aaron. Like I said, always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm just glad you could take some time out of your busy schedule to join me, because today we're going to talk about a topic that I think is probably one of the biggest opportunities and one of the biggest blind spots in wealth management. It's the idea around building meaningful relationships with the children and grandchildren of your best clients before a transition happens.
Right. Because honestly, most advisors know multi-generational planning absolutely matters, right? But very few actually have a process for building those relationships intentionally.
I agree. And the point you make is exactly on point. And that's where we're going to focus today is on tools like the family phone call and the legacy package, where these can become incredibly powerful in assisting in this process. Because this isn't just about estate planning. This is about helping advisors create continuity. It's about creating retention. It's about relationship transfer, increasing enterprise value, and ultimately helping clients feel confident that their families are going to be cared for long after they're gone. As I see it, when we talk about this concept, the real problem is that most advisors wait too long to really address this issue. And it's not that it's not necessarily a known issue, but it's that they wait, they put off, they delay. And I think that this becomes the biggest mistake that advisors can make, is assuming the relationship is automatically going to transfer with the assets.
Right. And I'll tell you, we see it time and time again. Relationships don't transfer automatically. Many advisors think, hey, just because I'm managing the assets of the parents, that the children are automatically going to follow suit and join in, right? But that familiarity, just like the trust, doesn't transfer automatically. It's very important to remember that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that it's an unknown. You and I talk to advisors all the time, and if I took a straw poll, most advisors have lived through the experience of watching one of their best clients, pass on, and then watching those assets disappear and evaporate with them. And the statistics actually bear it out as well. If you look at the studies that have been done in this industry, most statistics show that nearly 70% of heirs change advisors after inheriting wealth. And it really isn't a surprise. It really shouldn't be a surprise. But I think it's a huge opportunity and a missed opportunity, because there's so many advisors who don't take the opportunity to build those relationships early.
Yes, absolutely. Because in most cases, the children barely know the advisor, right? And a lot of these kids think, well, that's my parents' advisor. That's not my advisor. So in their head, they feel like they need to maybe get someone who's more in line with their values and their thoughts, right? Or worse, barely knowing the advisor, the first time they ever interact with the advisor is, during a period of grief after a death, where things are very confusing and it's a tough transition. And really, the last thing they want to be doing is being courted by their parents' financial advisor for a quick introduction, right? It's the last thing on their minds.
You know, having lost people that are close to me, and anybody who has lost someone close to them, that time, especially right after the loss, it's the last thing you want to do is be thrust into this process. And so
Yeah.
it's awkward on both ends. It's awkward for the advisor. It's awkward for the family. They just want to get this process over with. They don't want to talk about this, or sometimes they'll put it off, but that
Mhm.
doesn't help either. And so aligning yourself so that you don't create this opportunity where it's simply too late is
Yeah.
very important. One of the phrases that I use, and I know you use as well, internally, is the relationship should transfer before the wealth does.
Mhm.
Let me say that again. The relationship should transfer before the wealth does. And really that's the whole conversation we're having today.
Right. And this is an excellent chance to kind of reframe this whole opportunity, right? This isn't about selling to the kids. Um, and I think this is important, right? The conversation isn't about, trying to prospect your client's children. That's where advisors get really uncomfortable.
I I agree wholeheartedly. And look, it's you know, it's not that they won't become clients or can't become clients, and they may become clients through this process, but this is really about becoming part of the family support system. It's
Mhm.
about creating familiarity. It's about creating accessibility, but ultimately creating continuity.
Right. And honestly, some of the best advisors that I work with and that you've worked with in the past and currently working with, they're already doing this naturally, right? They just haven't necessarily systematized it yet with an actual process.
You know, that's why I love this family phone call concept so much. I know you and I have been familiar with this concept for quite a while. It was introduced to us through our relationship with Pareto and ultimately through our relationship with First Trust. And I believe
Hmm.
they gleaned this knowledge from an advisory team that was doing this very effectively
Yeah.
with their own client base. If I remember the story correctly, the advisory practice was essentially built almost like it was from the top down. It was grandparents, parents, kids, grandkids, where
Hmm.
it was their whole client base was built off these generations of clients. And
Yeah.
so ultimately, I think that's where we're really focusing. And so leveraging the family phone call concept, it allows you to create a simple, repeatable, low pressure. That's a key one. Low pressure
Yes.
framework for making those introductions happen. Honestly, happen naturally. And so when we talk about this, the family phone call, it's a simple process that has a massive impact. And so let's talk about what this really looks like itself. And let's kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts. So what I love about the process, and I know I've said it a bunch of times, but I'm going to use an additional word here. It's intentionally simple.
Hmm.
So look, we don't need to overcomplicate this. This is about human connection. This is about, um, building bridges and conveying it. And I say this because what I want to convey to anybody on the other end of this message is, if you go into this with, I, it, it doesn't sound conversational and it sounds like I'm selling somebody on something, it's going to fall flat.
Right.
This is not a 2-hour family summit. The family phone call is not a giant planning meeting. In fact, I shared this story with you not too long ago, Alan. I had a team who got thrust into what they thought was going to be a family phone call, but the client misunderstood and they made it a family meeting, a family summit. And quite frankly, what should have happened is a family phone call should have landed before a brief
Yeah.
opportunity to get to know one another. Because what happened was when they sat down for this meeting, the feel on the other side was that the advisory team was trying to sell the family members who didn't know them on something. And so if
Hmm.
there was a level of familiarity that would have made that a little simpler. So stage this stuff out. If you ever get in that situation, do the family phone call first, get to know everybody. Then if they want to have a family meeting, perfect, wonderful. And so understand, it's not a giant planning meeting. It's not a 2-hour family summit. This is typically just a brief 5 to 10-minute video conversation to get to know one another.
Right. And really that simplicity is what makes it scalable, right? The process guide that we can provide as a resource after this call lays out a very intentional structure, right? So in other words, you're sort of planting the seed during that spring strategy and tactical meeting, sort of introducing it formally, during a fall meeting, right? Schedule it immediately. Use resources like video technology, whether it's Zoom or Teams or something like that, and then following up intentionally after the family phone call takes place.
And I think the idea around immediately scheduling is critical.
Yeah.
Because look, if you leave this vague, and I know advisors have the best intentions, but if you go in with this, hey, let me know when your kids are available, this is probably never going to materialize. It's never going to happen.
Right. Exactly right. But when you position it as maybe taking a different route, this is part of our process. It's an important value-added service that we provide for our best clients. Now it feels intentional and not awkward.
There's that word, intentional.
Right.
It's something that we do with purpose. And again, this is not about selling. You're simply creating conversation. You're simply creating connection before life forces an uncomfortable conversation.
Right. And really that's getting back to the overall legacy package, making the invisible value visible. This is the world that you live in as a financial advisor, right? We're not selling widgets. There's nothing tangible here. So it's really about creating that value and making sure the client fully understands everything that you do, right? I think this is where the legacy package becomes that incredibly powerful as well. Because most advisors, like you say, they provide more than what clients actually recognize. And it really sort of reminds me of when we're having the conversation and coaching around the 7 pillars, right? We're talking about all the different things that you do over the life of a client relationship. Most of the times it's 75 to 150 things that you provide over the life of the client relationship. Only a few of them are really relevant at any given time. But what we convey to the client is eventually all of those things will become relevant at some point in your life. So it's sort of the same process, right? We want to make sure that the client sees the vast amount of value that is going to be provided over this. And the legacy package does a good job of bringing that to the forefront.
I love that concept. I love the whole simple thought of make the invisible value visible, in an intangible industry, create tangibility. It's, we talk about, and actually I think I was sent an Instagram post the other day that talked about one of the most, and actually you may have sent it to me now that I think about it, one of the most valuable skills being taught or should be taught is storytelling.
Yes.
And so this is a perfect example. It's, as an advisor, putting names to things, packaging things together, being able to tell a story that resonates with people is a huge part of what we do, especially, again, in an intangible industry that we work in. And so, a lot of advisors are already helping clients with things like beneficiaries or, coordinating the executor or having estate conversations or, charitable giving or charitable intent, or giving any kind of family guidance or even distribution planning, and ultimately transition support. But understandably, clients often see these as isolated conversations instead of part of a bigger philosophy around their personal legacy.
Exactly. And so the legacy package, think about it this way, it helps advisors connect all those dots into one cohesive story, right? The examples we reviewed already include things like generational planning, what's the word I'm looking for? Sounding board services, family phone calls, legacy clients, survivor checklists, things like executor checklists if you ever have a client that's in that scenario where they're an executor of an estate, but also just basic estate coordination and distribution planning.
And understand too, the legacy package is a simple resource. It is a marketing tool, to help our compliance friends. We are not advocating to give legal advice on estates. This is simply a way to highlight the areas of your practice that touch client personal legacy. And so understand that when you have a resource like the legacy package and you're able to have these conversations, this changes the conversation from simply we manage investments to we help families navigate life's transitions.
Yeah.
And that's a completely different level of value that you can bring to the table for your clients on an ongoing basis. And if you think about it on a new client relationship, it helps create professional contrast and a stark distinction between you and your competition, who may frankly do some of the same things, but they don't have a way of packaging or conveying it in a way that your clients can internalize it and then vocalize it to someone else. And so understand where this all flows to. The idea around the family phone call and the legacy package, ultimately, this is about protecting against natural attrition, the attrition that nobody likes to talk about.
Right.
One of the reasons I think this conversation matters so much right now is because simply natural attrition is what we all seem to be facing.
Yeah. And honestly, that's such an important phrase right there, the natural attrition, because, we're not talking about losing clients based off of things like, the performance didn't meet their standards or their expectation, or the pricing was too much, so I ended up leaving that advisor. We're talking about, aging clients. It's death, it's wealth transfer, it's that generational transition from that point. And that's really at the heart of it.
And I know you mentioned this to me before we got on the call. You mentioned the topic, the idea of widowhood. If we ran up statistics right now of how many people change advisors when, if the husband passes first and the wife is left, how many wives actually change advisors afterwards? And so that's part of the conversation as well. And look, every advisory firm, I don't care who you are, is going to face this eventually. If you haven't already, and if you've been in this business longer than a few years, you've probably faced this. Natural attrition is coming for every practice. The question is, are you proactively preparing for continuity? Or are you waiting and reacting after the transition has already happened?
Right. And honestly, many advisors end up spending more time chasing strangers than deepening relationships with with future clients who are already connected to their very best households.
That's such a powerful point. The idea of, we say it all the time, we talk about the whole premise around what we teach and coach to is around driving client advocacy, right? Instead of trying to convince the unconvinced, convince the already convinced to convince others on your behalf. That's a lot of convincing. But the powerful point here is your best future clients may already exist inside of your current client base as a natural connection to their kids and grandkids, to their circle of influence, as it were. And you simply just haven't met them yet.
Right. So the next step naturally is the practical implementation, right? What do we do next? How can advisors start this? So let's make it practical. If an advisor is listening or watching right now and they want to begin implementing, where would you suggest they start?
That's a great question. And I know you mentioned it earlier. I remember you mentioning the guide. We have some tools and resources. We have a best practices overview and guide for how to implement this, some agendas for the meetings, follow-up process, and also like follow-up emails. So we have a bunch of tools and resources that will help supplement this as part of the implementation of this process. But I would probably say the easiest and simplest for the sake of our call today would be simply identify your AAA and AA households. If you haven't already classified your clients, start there. But look at your ideal households. And these are the ones who are already clients. And these are the clients that you truly value relationships, long-term planning. But here's a key thing to understand. Look at your clients, your AAAs and AA clients. And when you look at those, if there's not a dotted line to a legacy relationship that already exists, and in our framework, what we talk about when we say legacy client, this is a children or grandchildren of those ideal relationships. If there's not an existing relationship already there, you might as well just go ahead and circle those assets, and you're just set a ticking clock waiting for them to leave your book of business. And so identify who these important relationships are, and then start seeing if there's not a relationship existing, then I need to be intentional about starting to create these relationships.
Right. And if I had to throw in a second, I know I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but start by planting that seed during the strategy and tactical meetings. Start letting your existing clients know. The guide again that we're referencing that we're going to provide after this segment specifically talks about introducing it first as a new value-added service that you now have access to. Before rolling it out or fully rolling it out later in the year. And if you have new clients coming on board, the easiest thing to do and the easiest way to implement it is really just to incorporate it into your new client process.
I love it.
And just simply say the next step in our process is to talk through this family phone call. Here's what it means. Here are the next steps. Here's how we execute it. And don't even leave it up as an option and just say, hey, this is the next step in what we do.
I love the idea of the non-negotiable. It is just part of our process. We've moved assets. We've set up accounts. We've done the estate planning. And the next thing is we need to meet with those who are important because we don't leave that to chance. I love it. That's so great. Probably the third thing in this process would be, in my opinion, use the legacy package. So, we kind of did it in reverse order today. We talked about the family phone call, and then we talked about the legacy package. But the legacy package is a simple on-ramp to start these conversations, but also to frame the bigger why. And, we always talk about the why, when the why is clear, the how becomes easy, right? So the bigger why is helping your clients understand continuity, stewardship, preparedness, and family support, and ultimately your role that you play in their personal legacy.
And honestly, from there, I'd say the next step is just to schedule that family phone call and do it immediately. Don't leave it open-ended. Don't leave it to twist in the wind and, again, be nonchalant about it and say, hey, when you got time, when the kids are in town, we should try to get this thing booked. And no, throw that away. Schedule it immediately. Don't leave it open-ended. The guide that we send out is going to remind you to be very intentional about that and just get it on the books.
And again, to reiterate, and we'll, mention it later, tools, resources, we've got that. We'll make it simple. But I guess the final piece to this puzzle, for the sake of brevity today, is once you've hosted that family phone call, once that meeting has happened, you've got to follow up with intentionality. Remember, we're building relationships here. You can't just, hey, nice to meet you, and never talk to them again. My recommendation, and this is spelled out clearly in the guide, is connect with them on LinkedIn if they have a LinkedIn profile. Definitely write them a handwritten note. I know it's an extra step, but take the time, write a little personal handwritten note. Really enjoyed the chance to meet you. It was a pleasure, blah, blah, blah. If you need some help with that, we can help with that as well. And as an extension of that, invite them to a sounding board session. We have another video, another podcast that talks about, and some resources that talk about the sounding board session. But in this context, it's really simply this. It's a 20 to 30 minute ask us anything session. Understand that the kids and the grandkids may not feel comfortable in that 5, 10, 15-minute call to ask a question about their own personal finances in front of grandma, in front of mom and dad, in front of their siblings, in front of their cousins maybe. So extend the opportunity that, hey, as an extension of your relationship with their loved ones, that you're willing to have this conversation, to let them ask some questions. You maybe could do some other little personal touches, and then definitely 100% definitely make sure you add them to your ongoing communication. If you're doing, if you have a newsletter that you send out, add them to the newsletter list. If you've got an email correspondence that you send out on market updates or whatever, add them to those communications because you want to stay top of mind, because that's a big part of advocacy, but it's about building relationships and not letting them forget about who you are.
Right. And if I wanted to share kind of as we ease into some of the closing thoughts here.
Yep.
At the end of the day, asset retention is a very important part of the process, right? But just as important, if not slightly more important, is creating that relationship continuity. right? And providing that higher level of value-added service for your clients. It's about helping these clients feel confident that the people that they care about will have that guidance, that support, that trusted relationship long after they're gone. And the advisors that understand that, become much more than just investment managers.
That's powerful. Much more than investment managers. I love that thought. The idea here is that you become trusted stewards of the family legacy. And ultimately, the relationship should transfer before the wealth does.
Yes.
And let me just wrap up by saying thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Rare Advisor podcast. If today's conversations challenged you to think differently about multi-generational relationships, continuity, and the client experience, then I challenge you to take the first step. Start the conversation, because the next generation of your best clients probably already exists. The question is, do they know who you are yet?
Yeah.
So, as I always say, remember, when the why is clear, the how becomes easy. So never lose sight of your why.
This information is for licensed financial professionals only and is not intended for use in soliciting sales from the public. The views expressed represent the opinions of the presenter or their featured guest, not necessarily those of USA Financial or its affiliated subsidiaries. Industry references are generic and not intended to represent actions or beliefs of any individual or entity. Content is only presented to illustrate general principles, beliefs, or ideas and should not be construed as legal or regulatory advice. Trademark and copyright protected. USA Financial and Affiliates.